The brass key turned in the lock with the smooth precision of a mechanism that had been waiting over a century for exactly this moment. Margaret Whaley's hand trembled as the heavy wooden door of the Victorian house on San Diego Avenue swung open with a groan that seemed to rise from the very foundations. 3 days had passed since the package arrived at her Boston apartment with no return address, containing only this key and a yellowed note written in spidery handwriting, "It's time to come home." Margaret had never seen this house before, yet something deep in her bones recognized every weathered board, every ornate piece of trim that decorated the wraparound porch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the threshold, and as she stepped forward, the floorboards beneath her feet sang out in protest after decades of silence. "Hello." Her voice echoed through the empty hallway, swallowed by rooms that stretched deeper into the house than the exterior suggested possible. Dust motes danced in shafts of golden light that streamed through gaps in the boarded windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that made Margaret feel as though she were stepping into a photograph from another era. The interior was impossibly preserved. Wallpaper that should have been peeling hung perfectly intact, depicting roses that seemed to turn their heads to follow her movement. A grandfather clock stood silent in a corner, its hands frozen at midnight, and family portraits lined the hallway walls with eyes that tracked her progress with unsettling intensity. "Margaret." The whisper came from somewhere deep within the house, soft as breath against her ear. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The voice was unmistakably female, aged and gentle, speaking her name with the familiarity of blood relation. "Who's there?" Margaret called out, but the house responded only with settling wood and the distant sound of wind through broken boards. She pulled out her phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal, just a blank void where the carrier bars should have been. Margaret moved deeper into the house, drawn by curiosity stronger than her growing fear. The parlor opened to her left, furnished with Victorian pieces covered in white sheets that looked as though they'd been placed yesterday rather than decades ago. A daguerreotype sat on the mantelpiece showing a severe-looking woman in black silk, and Margaret gasped as she recognized the face from old family albums her grandmother had shown her as a child. "Great-great-grandmother Anna," she whispered, reaching toward the photograph. The moment her fingers brushed the frame, the whisper came again, closer this time. "Margaret, dear child. You've finally come home." The voice seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, resonating through the floorboards and settling into Margaret's chest like a weight. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but found only empty doorways and shadows that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. "This isn't possible," Margaret said aloud, her voice shakier than she intended. "Anna Whaley died in 1885. I read about it in the genealogy records. Death is not the end in this house, child. It's merely a change of rooms." The brass key in Margaret's hand grew warm, then hot, forcing her to drop it. But when she looked down at the hardwood floor, the key was nowhere to be found. Panic rose in her throat as she realized what this meant. Without the key, she might be trapped inside until someone came looking for her. But who would think to look for her here? She'd told no one about the mysterious package or her impulsive decision to fly to San Diego to investigate. Margaret retraced her steps to the front door, but when she turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. The wood felt solid as stone beneath her palms, and the windows she could see were boarded up from the outside with boards that looked fresh and new, despite the house's obvious age. "Let me out," she called, pounding on the door with both fists. "Let me out right now." "But you just arrived, dear. And we have so much to discuss." This time the voice came from directly behind her. Margaret whirled around and found herself face to face with a woman who looked exactly like the photograph on the mantelpiece, only now the severe expression had softened into something that might have been maternal if not for the terrible sadness in her dark eyes. Anna Whaley wore the same black silk dress from the daguerreotype, but now Margaret could see that the fabric was stained with something dark that had dried to the color of rust. The woman's skin had the translucent quality of old parchment, and when she moved, she cast no shadow in the afternoon light. "You're not real," Margaret whispered, backing against the unyielding door. "You're not real. Reality is more flexible in this house than in the world outside," Anna said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I've been waiting so long for you to come. The last of our line. The final key to unlock what we've kept buried all these years." Margaret's great-great-grandmother moved closer, and Margaret could smell something terrible on the air, not decay, but something far worse. The scent of secrets kept too long, of guilt that had fermented into something poisonous. "What do you want from me?" Margaret managed to ask. Anna's expression grew infinitely sad, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations. "I want you to understand what this family has done. What we've built this house upon. What we've fed to keep ourselves safe and prosperous." The temperature in the room began to drop, and Margaret could see her breath misting in the air. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and writhe, and she could swear she heard other voices now, whispering just below the threshold of hearing. "The foundation was laid in blood, child. And blood calls to blood across the centuries. You carry our sins in your veins, and it's time you knew the price of the name you bear." Margaret pressed herself harder against the door, feeling the brass handle dig into her back. "I don't understand. I don't know anything about this house or our family history. My parents never talked about San Diego or any relatives here." Anna's laugh was like wind through dry leaves. "Of course they didn't. They ran as far as they could, hoping distance would break the bonds. But some chains stretch across continents, Margaret. Some debts compound with interest until they can no longer be ignored." The portraits along the hallway began to whisper, their painted mouths moving in conversations Margaret couldn't quite make out. The house itself seemed to pulse around them, walls breathing with a rhythm that matched her hammering heartbeat. "Every family has secrets," Anna continued, circling Margaret like a predator. "But ours run deeper than most. We built our fortune on a foundation of borrowed time, Margaret. And the bill has finally come due." Margaret closed her eyes tight, hoping that when she opened them, she'd find herself back in her Boston apartment, that this would all prove to be some elaborate nightmare. But when she looked again, Anna was still there, and now she could see other figures beginning to materialize in the shadowy doorways, men and women in clothing from different eras, all watching her with the same expectant hunger. "What do you want me to do?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Anna smiled, and Margaret noticed that her teeth were stained dark. "I want you to listen, child. Listen to the true history of the Whaley family. And then I want you to choose whether you'll honor our debts or add your bones to the foundation." The house groaned around them, and Margaret realized with growing horror that the sound wasn't coming from settling wood. It was coming from below, from something vast and patient that had been waiting in the darkness beneath their feet for longer than she wanted to imagine. Have you ever felt called to a place that terrified you? What would you do if the dead were summoning you home? Margaret followed Anna deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing through rooms that seemed to expand beyond their physical limitations. Each doorway they passed revealed glimpses of lives lived and lost, a child's rocking horse that moved on its own, a dining room table set for dinner guests who would never come, bedrooms where the sheets still bore the impressions of bodies that had lain there over a century ago. "Tell me about the voices," Anna said as they walked. "You heard them calling your name, didn't you? Even before you entered the house." Margaret nodded reluctantly. "For the past 3 nights. I thought I was dreaming, but they felt so real. Women's voices, calling from far away. Not from far away, child. From deep inside. The women of our family have always been the most sensitive to what lies beneath." Anna paused at a heavy wooden door that Margaret hadn't noticed before. This was Thomas's study. "Your great-great-grandfather. He kept meticulous records of everything that happened in this house after we moved in. The study was a shrine to obsessive documentation. Every wall was lined with leather-bound journals, and the massive oak desk was covered with maps, photographs, and handwritten notes that sprawled across dozens of pages. Margaret approached the desk and found an open journal dated 1868, written in a precise masculine hand. June 15, 1868, she read aloud. The sounds have returned with greater intensity. Anna claims she hears children playing in the courtyard at midnight, though we have no children and our neighbors are too distant for their voices to carry. I have walked the grounds during these nocturnal episodes and found no evidence of living souls. Keep reading, Anna urged, and Margaret noticed that her great-great-grandmother's voice had taken on an edge of anticipation. June 22, 1868. A most disturbing occurrence. Mr. Henderson came to call yesterday afternoon but never emerged from the house. Anna insists he left through the back door while I was in town, but Henderson's horse remains tied to our post and his hat sits on our hall table. I have searched every room to no avail. Margaret's hands began to shake as she turned the page. June 30, 1868. 3 more visitors have vanished from our home this month. Anna grows increasingly agitated, claiming she hears them moving through the walls at night, calling for help. I fear my wife's mind may be fracturing under the strain of our isolation. My mind was perfectly sound, Anna said coldly. It was Thomas who refused to see what was happening. He built this house over something that should have been left undisturbed, and then when the consequences began to manifest, he chose denial over action. Margaret continued reading, her voice growing weaker with each entry. July 8, 1868. I can no longer ignore the evidence. Visitors enter our home but do not leave, yet thorough searches reveal no bodies, no signs of foul play. Anna speaks of feeding something beneath the foundation, of debts owed to forces I cannot comprehend. I fear we have built our home atop cursed ground. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees, and Margaret could see her breath forming clouds in the air. The journals on the shelves began to whisper, pages turning of their own accord, revealing decades of similar entries written by different hands across multiple generations. Show her the photograph collection, a new voice said from the doorway. Margaret turned to see a man in a dark Victorian coat, his face gaunt and eyes hollow with decades of sleepless nights. I'm Thomas Whaley. And it's time she understood the full scope of what she's inherited. Thomas moved to a cabinet and withdrew a collection of daguerreotypes and photographs spanning nearly a century. He spread them across the desk like playing cards, each image showing the same scene, groups of people standing on the front porch of the Whaley house, smiling and posed for formal portraits. Family gatherings, business meetings, social calls, Thomas explained. All perfectly normal occasions. But look closely at the faces, Margaret. Study them carefully. Margaret leaned closer and gasped. In every photograph, several of the people had their eyes scratched out, their faces marked with what looked like deliberate defacement. But it wasn't vandalism, the scratches were part of the original images, as if something had reached through the camera lens itself to claim those souls. Everyone whose face is marked disappeared from this house, Anna said quietly. Not just visitors, Margaret. Family members, friends, business associates. They came to call and simply never left. But where did they go? Margaret asked, though she was beginning to fear the answer. Thomas and Anna exchanged a look that carried the weight of decades of shared horror. They went down, Thomas said finally. Into the foundation. Into the thing that demanded to be fed. The walls around them began to whisper more loudly now, voices layering upon voices until Margaret could make out individual words. Help us, don't leave, make it stop, please, repeated endlessly in tones of desperation that made her skin crawl. You hear them now, don't you? Anna asked. The voices of everyone who ever entered this house and failed to leave. They're still here, Margaret. Still conscious, still aware, trapped in the spaces between the walls and under the floorboards. Margaret backed away from the desk, but Thomas moved to block her path to the door. "You can't leave yet," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Not until you understand the choice that faces you. The same choice that faced every generation of Whaleys before you." "What choice?" Margaret demanded, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Whether to break the cycle or perpetuate it," Anna answered. "Whether to starve the thing beneath the foundation and risk its wrath, or feed it as we have for generations and maintain the terrible balance that has kept our bloodline alive." The photographs on the desk began to move, showing the marked faces turning toward Margaret with expressions of pleading desperation. The scratched-out eyes seemed to weep tears of black ink that pooled on the antique wood. "Your parents chose to run," Thomas continued. "They fled to the opposite coast and never spoke of their heritage, hoping distance would sever the bonds. But some hungers grow stronger with denial, Margaret. Some debts compound until they can no longer be ignored." Margaret could hear movement below them now, something vast and restless stirring in the foundation of the house. The floorboards beneath her feet grew warm, then hot, as if heated from below by some internal fire. "It knows you're here," Anna whispered. "It's been waiting so long for the bloodline to return. Waiting to be properly fed again, or to finally break free from the constraints that have held it in check." "I won't do this," Margaret said, though her voice shook with fear. "I won't feed people to some monster just to save myself." Anna's expression grew infinitely sad. "That's what they all said, child. Every generation produced at least one family member with a conscience, someone who thought they could break the pattern. Would you like to see what happened to them?" Before Margaret could answer, the walls of the study became transparent, revealing the interior structure of the house. Margaret saw dozens of human forms pressed between the wooden beams, their bodies twisted and compressed but somehow still alive, still aware. Their mouths moved in silent screams, their eyes tracking her movement with desperate hope. "The conscientious ones," Thomas explained. "The family members who refused to participate. They became part of the house itself, conscious but powerless, feeding the foundation with their own life force instead of bringing it fresh victims." Margaret sank into Thomas's desk chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the horror she'd inherited. "How long has this been going on?" "Since 1857, Anna replied. "The year Thomas first broke ground on this property. He didn't know what lay buried beneath the earth, didn't understand that some places are meant to remain empty. By the time we realized what we'd awakened, it was too late to turn back." The voices in the walls grew louder, and Margaret realized they were trying to warn her of something. She looked up to see Thomas and Anna watching her with expressions that had shifted from sadness to something approaching hunger. "The thing below isn't the only predator in this house," Margaret whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "You're not trying to save me. You're trying to recruit me." Anna smiled, and Margaret saw that her teeth had grown sharper since their conversation began. "Every family needs someone to tend the foundation, dear child. Someone to make the difficult choices and ensure the cycle continues. Your parents abandoned their responsibilities, but you're here now. You can set things right." Margaret stood abruptly, knocking over the chair. "I'm leaving. Right now." "No," Thomas said simply, and Margaret found herself unable to move, her feet rooted to the floor as if she'd grown roots. "You'll stay until you've learned the full truth. Until you've seen what lies beneath us and made your choice." The floorboards began to crack beneath her feet, revealing glimpses of something vast and hungry moving in the darkness below. Margaret realized with growing terror that her ordeal was just beginning. Thomas led Margaret through a doorway that hadn't existed moments before, into a corridor lined with portraits of Whaley family members spanning generations. Each painting bore a small brass nameplate, and Margaret noticed with growing unease that many of the dates ended abruptly in the middle of promising lives. Sarah Whaley, 1840 to 1863, she read aloud from the first portrait, studying the face of a young woman whose eyes held a familiar stubborn intelligence. "She looks like she could be my sister." She was 23 when she chose to defy the Foundation's hunger, Anna said, her voice carrying the weight of old grief. Brilliant girl, full of modern ideas about breaking free from family traditions. She lasted 6 months before the house claimed her. Margaret moved to the next portrait. Marcus Whaley, 1822 to 1859. He died young too. Thomas nodded grimly. Marcus tried to burn the house down, thinking fire would cleanse whatever evil had taken root. The flames wouldn't take hold, but something else did. We found him in the basement 3 days later, aged decades in hours, his hair white and his mind shattered. As they walked deeper into the corridor, Margaret noticed that the portraits began to change. The painted faces seemed to follow her movement, and several times she could swear she saw lips moving as if trying to speak warnings she couldn't hear. Every generation, at least one family member tried to break the pattern, Anna continued. And every generation, they learned the same hard lesson: some bargains, once made, cannot be unmade. The best we can hope for is to manage the terms. Margaret stopped at a portrait of a man who bore such a strong resemblance to her father that it took her breath away. The nameplate read, William Whaley, 1925 to 1943. "My grandfather's brother," Margaret whispered. "My father said he died in the war." "William died right here in this house," Thomas corrected. "He'd discovered the journals, learned about the family's true history. Came back from college with ideas about exposing everything, about bringing in priests and scientists to study what lived in our foundation." Anna touched the portrait's frame with something approaching tenderness. "He was so young, so certain that he could be the one to finally break free. He lasted longer than most, almost a full year of fighting against the influence. But in the end, the hunger always wins." The corridor opened into a library that seemed to stretch beyond the physical limitations of the house. Shelves reached up into shadows that no light could penetrate, filled with books that chronicled decades of careful documentation. Margaret pulled one volume at random and found it filled with meticulous records of disappearances, each entry detailing how visitors to the house had been selected, lured, and ultimately consumed. "We tried to be selective," Thomas explained, seeing her horrified expression. "Drifters, people who wouldn't be missed, criminals who deserved punishment. We told ourselves we were serving a kind of justice, feeding the Foundation with those who had forfeited their right to continued existence." Margaret slammed the book shut. "You were murderers. All of you. For generations." "We were survivors," Anna replied sharply. "Do you think we enjoyed making these choices? Do you think any of us slept peacefully knowing what we'd built our prosperity upon? But the alternative was worse, Margaret. So much worse." The walls of the library began to show scenes like moving photographs, glimpses of what had happened to families who had tried to abandon their responsibilities to similar entities. Margaret saw houses collapsing with entire bloodlines trapped inside, family members aging decades in minutes as their life force was drained to feed hungry foundations, children born twisted and wrong as curses passed through generations of untended deaths. "The Hendersons tried to break their pact in 1889, Anna said, pointing to one particularly disturbing image. "Their house stood 3 miles from here. When they refused to continue the feeding, the thing beneath their foundation grew so hungry it consumed the entire family in a single night. We could hear their screams from here." Margaret sank into a leather chair that was far too comfortable for the horror surrounding her. "There has to be another way. In over a century, someone must have found a way to break free without everyone dying." Thomas and Anna exchanged another of their weighted looks. "There was one," Thomas admitted reluctantly. One method that might work, though it's never been attempted by anyone in our family. Tell me, Margaret demanded. Complete confession, Anna said quietly. Total honesty about every crime committed, every life taken, every moment of moral cowardice that fed the Foundation's growth. The entity feeds on secrets, on guilt buried deep and left to fester. Theoretically, if someone could speak every hidden truth aloud, acknowledge every shameful act without reservation, it might starve the Foundation enough to weaken its hold. Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Then that's what I'll do. I'll confess everything I know about the family's crimes. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Child, you know nothing about our family's true crimes. You've lived your entire life protected from the reality of what we've done. The disappearances were just the beginning, the Foundation required deeper nourishment over time. What do you mean? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Anna moved to another section of the library and returned with a different set of journals. The indigenous people who originally lived on this land tried to warn us, she said. They told Thomas that certain places were meant to remain untouched, that building here would awaken something that had been contained for centuries. He dismissed their concerns as superstition. Margaret opened the first journal and found entries detailing systematic displacement and violence against the native population. You drove them away from their sacred sites. We did worse than that, Thomas admitted. When they tried to perform rituals to recontain what we'd awakened, we stopped them. We burned their ceremonial grounds and scattered their communities because their activities were interfering with our property values. The temperature in the library plummeted, and Margaret could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. You destroyed the very people who might have been able to help you. Anna nodded gravely. And that original sin created the foundation upon which all our other crimes were built. Every life we fed to the entity, every family member we sacrificed to maintain the balance, every visitor who disappeared, all of it grew from that first moment of choosing profit over righteousness. Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the far end of the library where the shadows seemed to writhe with independent life. Then I'll confess that too. I'll confess every crime the family committed, starting with the original displacement. You still don't understand, Thomas said sadly. The confession must come from someone who carries personal guilt for the crimes. You've never harmed anyone, never made the choices we've made. Your words would carry no weight with the entity. Margaret felt the walls closing in around her, both literally and figuratively. Then what's the point of telling me any of this? Why bring me here if there's no way out? Anna approached her slowly, as a mother might approach a frightened child. Because there is a way, Margaret. But it requires you to take on the guilt willingly, to accept responsibility for every crime committed by every generation of Whaleys. To make their sins your own and then confess them as if you had committed them yourself. The psychological weight alone would destroy most minds, Thomas added. To truly accept responsibility for over a century of murder, theft, and moral cowardice, to feel the guilt of it as if each act were your own, very few people could survive the experience with their sanity intact. Margaret looked between her ghostly ancestors, understanding finally dawning. You're not asking me to save the family. You're asking me to sacrifice myself in a different way. We're offering you the choice we never had, Anna replied. The chance to end this cycle forever, even if the cost is your own destruction. Or you can choose to continue our work, to feed the foundation and maintain the terrible balance for another generation. The house groaned around them, and Margaret realized the entity beneath the foundation was growing impatient. Soon, she would have to choose between perpetuating evil or destroying herself to stop it. And in the shadows between the library shelves, she could swear she saw other figures watching, all the family members who had faced this same impossible choice and failed to find a third option. The weight of generations pressed down on her shoulders, and Margaret understood that whatever decision she made would echo through eternity. Margaret's contemplation was interrupted by a sound that made her blood freeze, a child's laughter echoing from somewhere deep within the house. The sound was innocent enough on its own, but in this place where no child should exist, it carried implications that made her stomach clench with dread. "Who is that?" Margaret whispered, moving toward the source of the laughter. Thomas and Anna exchanged the darkest look yet. "That would be little Emma," Anna said quietly. "She was 7 years old when we realized the foundation required a different kind of nourishment. Adult guilt and fear were no longer enough. It craved innocence." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. "You fed children to that thing?" "One child," Thomas corrected, his voice heavy with self-loathing. "Just one, in 1872. Our own granddaughter. Anna and I told ourselves it was mercy. Emma was dying of consumption anyway, wasting away slowly. We convinced ourselves that a quick death feeding the foundation was kinder than months of suffering." The laughter came again, closer now, accompanied by the sound of small feet running through corridors that shouldn't exist. Margaret followed the sound deeper into the house, Thomas and Anna trailing behind her like guilty shadows. "Emma never left," Anna explained as they walked. "Unlike the adults who disappeared, children seem to retain more of themselves after being consumed. She's been playing in these halls for over a century, and she's so very lonely." They reached a door Margaret was certain hadn't been there before, smaller than the others, painted white with cheerful yellow flowers that seemed obscenely innocent in the context of the house's horrors. The laughter was coming from directly beyond it. "Don't open that door," Thomas warned. "Emma likes visitors, but she doesn't understand that her games can be harmful to the living." Margaret's hand was already on the doorknob. Something about the child's laughter called to her maternal instincts, even knowing the truth about what lay beyond. She turned the handle and stepped into what appeared to be a child's playroom, complete with antique toys and furniture sized for someone very small. Emma sat in the center of the room, playing with a collection of dolls that Margaret realized with horror were perfect miniatures of every person who had ever disappeared in the house. The child looked up at Margaret's entrance, and her face was exactly as it would have been in 1872, 7 years old, with ringlets of blonde hair and eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. "Are you here to play with me?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the cadence of a different era. "It's been so long since someone new came to visit. The others don't like to play anymore, they just whisper and cry and beg to go home." Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, her heart breaking despite everything she knew about this child's origin. "What kind of games do you like to play, Emma?" "Hide and seek is my favorite," Emma replied, her smile revealing teeth that were too sharp for a human child. "I hide, and the visitors seek. But they never find me until it's time to feed the foundation. Then I show them where I've been hiding all along." Emma gestured to the dolls arranged around her, and Margaret saw that each miniature figure was posed in an expression of terror, their tiny mouths open in silent screams. They always look so surprised when they see what's underneath the house. As if they thought the pretty rooms upstairs were all there was to see. "What is underneath the house, Emma?" Margaret asked gently. Emma's expression grew serious beyond her apparent years. "The hungry place. The place where all the visitors go when they stop being interesting. It's very dark down there, and it makes the most wonderful sounds when it feeds." Margaret felt Thomas and Anna standing in the doorway behind her, but she didn't turn around. Something in Emma's demeanor suggested that any sudden movement might trigger the wrong kind of response. "Would you like to see the hungry place?" Emma asked with the innocent enthusiasm of a child suggesting a trip to the park. "I can take you there. It's right beneath the kitchen, behind a door that most people never notice." "I don't think I'm ready for that yet," Margaret said carefully. "Maybe we could play something else first." Emma pouted, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. "But that's the best game." And the hungry place is so excited to meet you, Margaret. It's been dreaming about you for months, ever since your parents' protection finally wore thin. Margaret felt ice form in her veins. What protection? They made their own bargain, Emma explained matter-of-factly. Your parents. They promised the Foundation that if it left you alone until you turned 35, they would make sure you came back to fulfill your obligations. They thought 35 years would be enough time for you to live a full life. Margaret's 35th birthday had been 3 days ago. The same day the mysterious package arrived. They sold me, Margaret whispered, understanding flooding through her with devastating clarity. My own parents sold me to save themselves. Emma nodded cheerfully. Everyone gets sold eventually. It's the way families work. The old ones protect themselves by sacrificing the young ones. That's what makes the Foundation so happy, it feeds on betrayal just as much as it feeds on flesh. Margaret stood abruptly, her legs shaking with rage and despair. Show me the basement door, Emma. I want to see this thing that my family has been serving. Emma clapped her hands together with delight. Oh, wonderful. It's been so long since someone asked to see the hungry place willingly. Usually I have to trick them or chase them down there. The child skipped out of the playroom and down a corridor that led to the back of the house. Margaret followed, with Thomas and Anna trailing behind, their ghostly forms growing more solid as they approached whatever lay beneath the foundation. The kitchen was a masterpiece of Victorian design, complete with a massive cast-iron stove and hand-pumped well. But Emma led Margaret to what appeared to be a pantry door tucked into an alcove beside the fireplace. Most people think it's just a storage closet, Emma explained, her hand resting on the simple wooden handle. But it goes down much further than that. The hungry place likes to stay hidden until feeding time. Margaret could hear something moving beyond the door, not the scurrying of rats or the settling of wood, but something vast and patient that breathed with the rhythm of ocean tides. The brass key from her arrival materialized in her hand, grown warm from proximity to whatever waited below. The key always comes back when it's needed, Emma said. It's part of the Foundation's design. No one enters the hungry place by accident, they have to choose to unlock the door. Margaret looked back at Thomas and Anna, seeing her own fear reflected in their ghostly faces. Is this the choice you mentioned? Feed myself to the entity or find some other way to break the cycle? This is where every generation of Whaleys has stood, Anna confirmed. At this door, with this key, making the same decision. Some chose to go down the stairs and face whatever waited. Others chose to become recruiters, bringing fresh victims to feed the Foundation. None chose correctly. What would choosing correctly look like? Margaret asked. Emma giggled. Maybe you'll be the first to figure it out. The hungry place thinks you're very special, Margaret. It's been preparing something extra wonderful for your visit. Margaret inserted the key into the lock, her hand trembling with the weight of generations of wrong choices. The door swung open to reveal a staircase that descended far deeper than should have been possible beneath a two-story house, disappearing into darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely lacking it. From the depths came a sound like whale song mixed with human screaming, and Margaret realized she was about to discover what happened to over a century's worth of missing people. Would you sacrifice yourself to save future generations, or fight to break a curse that has claimed your entire bloodline? Margaret descended the stairs with Emma's small hand in hers, each step taking her further from any possibility of turning back. The darkness below was absolute, swallowing the beam of her phone's flashlight as if light itself were being consumed. Behind her, Thomas and Anna followed in silence, their ghostly forms providing the only illumination in the consuming blackness. How deep does this go? Margaret asked, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Deep enough, Emma replied cheerfully. The hungry place needed lots of room to grow. It's been expanding for over a century, making space for all its friends. The stairs seemed to descend for much longer than the height of the house could possibly accommodate. Margaret counted 200 steps, then 300, before she finally saw a faint glow emanating from below. As they approached the source of the light, she began to make out the true scope of what lay beneath the Whaley house. The basement opened into a cavern that stretched beyond the reach of vision, carved from living rock that pulsed with veins of phosphorescent minerals. But it wasn't a natural cave. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing the perfectly preserved remains of a human being. Dozens of them, then hundreds, arranged in neat rows like a macabre library of the dead. Everyone who ever visited the house and failed to leave, Thomas explained, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. The foundation preserves them, keeps them conscious but immobile. They experience everything but can influence nothing. Margaret approached the nearest alcove and gasped. The man inside was dressed in clothing from the 1890s, his eyes tracking her movement with desperate awareness. His mouth moved silently, forming words she couldn't hear but could clearly understand. "Help me." "They're all alive," Margaret whispered in horror. "Alive, aware, and eternally hungry," Anna confirmed. "The foundation feeds on their consciousness, their memories, their slowly accumulating despair. Death would be a mercy, but the entity requires them to remain aware to properly nourish its growth." Emma tugged on Margaret's hand. Pulling her deeper into the cavern toward the source of the phosphorescent glow. "The hungry place wants to show you its heart," the child said with unsettling enthusiasm. "It's been growing something very special just for you." At the center of the cavern, Margaret found the true foundation of the Whaley house, not wood and stone, but something organic and vast that defied easy description. It resembled a massive root system crossed with neural tissue, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that created the eerie light filling the space. Tendrils stretched from the central mass to each alcove, connecting the entity to its preserved victims like some horrific nervous system. "What is it?" Margaret breathed, unable to look away from the hypnotic patterns of light flowing through the creature's translucent flesh. "It's very old," a new voice said from the shadows. Margaret turned to see a figure emerging from the darkness, a woman in native dress whose eyes held the weight of centuries. "Older than your houses, older than your civilization. My people knew of its existence long before your ancestors arrived with their axes and their greed." Thomas stepped forward, his ghostly form flickering with agitation. "Margaret, don't listen to her. She's one of the indigenous spirits we displaced. She'll fill your head with lies." The woman smiled sadly. "Lies, Thomas Whaley. Like the lie that this creature was contained safely beneath the earth. Like the lie that building your house here was an accident rather than a deliberate choice." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not physically, but mentally, as new truths began to reshape her understanding of her family's crimes. "What do you mean, deliberate?" "Your great-great-grandfather knew exactly what lay buried here," the woman continued. "He didn't stumble upon cursed ground by accident. He sought it out, believing he could harness the entity's power for his own gain." The central mass pulsed brighter, and Margaret could swear she heard it humming with something approaching contentment. Around the cavern, the preserved victims began to moan in unison, their voices creating a harmony that made her bones ache with resonant frequency. "Show her the original contract," the indigenous woman said to Thomas. "Show her what your ancestor really signed when he broke ground on this land." Thomas's form grew more solid as his shame deepened. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, producing a document that materialized from the air like smoke taking shape. "I thought I could control it, use its hunger to eliminate my business rivals and political enemies. I never imagined it would grow so powerful, so demanding." Margaret took the contract with trembling hands. Written in multiple languages, English, Spanish, and what appeared to be some form of pictographic script, the document laid out terms that made her stomach turn. Thomas had agreed to provide the entity with regular nourishment in exchange for prosperity, protection, and the elimination of anyone who threatened his interests. You didn't just feed it random victims, Margaret realized. You used it as a weapon. The Henderson family controlled the most profitable shipping routes, Thomas admitted. The Mortons owned the best farmland. The Ramirez family had political connections I needed. One by one, I invited them to dinner parties and business meetings, then let the foundation claim them. Emma giggled and clapped her hands. Grandpa Thomas was very clever. Much cleverer than the hungry place expected. But being too clever made the hungry place grow much bigger and hungrier than it was supposed to. The indigenous woman nodded gravely. The entity was contained by my people's ceremonies for over 1,000 years. It was meant to remain dormant, fed only by the natural death and decay of the forest above. But your ancestors' deliberate feeding awakened appetites that were never meant to be satisfied. Margaret looked around the cavern with new understanding. This isn't just a family curse. This is an ecological disaster. A spiritual contamination that's been spreading for over a century. The influence extends far beyond this house, the woman confirmed. Other families throughout San Diego have been touched by its corruption. The entity sends out tendrils through the ground, seeking new sources of nourishment, new bloodlines to exploit. Your family was just the first to be fully consumed. The central mass pulsed again, and this time Margaret heard its voice, not words, but pure meaning transmitted directly into her consciousness. It was ravenously hungry, but also curious about her. Unlike previous generations of Whaleys, Margaret carried no guilt for its feeding, no complicity in its crimes. She was a clean slate, unburdened by the moral compromises that had bound her ancestors to their terrible service. It wants to make a new bargain with me, Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. It's tired of the old arrangement, tired of being tied to a single family. It wants to spread, to find new sources of power and influence. And if you refuse? Thomas asked. The entity's response came as a wave of images flooding Margaret's mind, the house collapsing, taking her with it, the creature breaking free from its underground prison and spreading across the city like a cancer, her parents and every distant Whaley relative aging decades and minutes as their life force was drained to pay for generations of accumulated debt. But there's something it doesn't know, the indigenous woman said quietly. Something your ancestors never understood about the true nature of this creature. Emma's cheerful demeanor suddenly shifted, her child's face twisting into something ancient and hungry. Don't listen to her, Margaret. She wants to trick you into making things worse. The hungry place has been very good to your family. It can be good to you too. Margaret realized with growing horror that Emma wasn't a preserved victim of the entity, she was part of it, a fragment of its consciousness given form to better manipulate the living. You're not a ghost. You're one of its appendages. I'm whatever I need to be, Emma replied, her voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. I'm the face that makes the hard choices easier to accept. The innocent facade that makes murder feel like mercy. The phosphorescent patterns in the creature's flesh began to pulse faster, and Margaret could feel its attention focusing on her with uncomfortable intensity. The preserved victims around the cavern began to struggle against their paralysis, as if her presence had given them hope for the first time in decades. Tell me what it doesn't know, Margaret said to the indigenous woman, raising her voice above the increasing volume of the entity's humming. It feeds on guilt, on secrets, on the weight of unconfessed sins, the woman replied. But it has never encountered someone willing to speak the truth about its own nature. It has hidden behind human agents for so long that it has forgotten what happens when its crimes are laid bare to the light. Margaret looked around the cavern at the hundreds of preserved victims, at the ghostly forms of her ancestors, at the pulsing mass of alien flesh that had corrupted her bloodline for generations. She thought about her parents' betrayal, about the children who would inherit this curse if she failed to act, about all the families whose lives had been destroyed to feed one creature's insatiable hunger. "I need to confess," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. "Not just my family's crimes, but its crimes too. I need to speak the truth about what this thing really is and what it's done." The entity's humming became a roar of rage and alarm. Around the cavern, the preserved victims began to scream, not in pain, but in encouragement, lending their voices to Margaret's dawning resolve. Margaret stood before the writhing mass of the entity, her voice cutting through its roars of protest as she began to speak truths that had been buried for over a century. "You are not a god," she declared, her words echoing through the cavern with supernatural clarity. "You are not a force of nature or a cosmic power. You are a parasite that feeds on human weakness and calls it strength." The creature's phosphorescent patterns flared brighter, and the temperature in the cavern began to rise as its rage built to dangerous levels. The preserved victims around the walls began to stir more violently, their paralysis weakening as Margaret's words somehow disrupted the entity's control over them. "For 168 years, you have hidden behind my family's crimes," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger despite the creature's attempts to drown her out. "You convinced Thomas Whaley that he was making a smart business decision, that eliminating his rivals was just good strategy. But you were the one who suggested their names, who whispered in his ear during sleepless nights, who turned natural ambition into monstrous appetite." Thomas's ghostly form began to flicker and change, his Victorian composure cracking as Margaret's words forced him to confront truths he'd spent decades avoiding. "I thought the ideas were my own," he whispered. "I thought I was being clever, using the creature's hunger to solve my problems." "You planted those thoughts," Margaret accused the entity directly. "You fed his greed and called it inspiration. You took a man's natural desire for success and twisted it into a justification for mass murder." The indigenous woman stepped closer, adding her voice to Margaret's. "Speak the names," she urged. "Speak the names of everyone it has consumed, every crime it has committed through human hands." Margaret closed her eyes and somehow the names came to her, flowing from some deep well of inherited memory. Jacob Henderson, murdered for his shipping contracts. Maria Santos, killed for her land rights. The Patterson children, sacrificed because their father opposed Thomas's political ambitions. With each name spoken, one of the preserved victims broke free from their paralysis, stepping out of their alcoves with movements that were jerky and uncertain after decades of immobility. Their voices joined Margaret's, adding their own testimonies to the growing litany of accusation. "Anna Whaley," Margaret continued, turning to her great-great-grandmother's ghost, "you knew the entity was manipulating your husband, but you chose complicity over resistance. You told yourself you were protecting your family, but you were really protecting your comfort." Anna's ghostly form began to weep tears of ectoplasm. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of poverty, afraid of losing our position in society. I thought if I could just manage the situation, control how many people disappeared, I could keep the monster satisfied without letting it grow too powerful." "But it did grow more powerful," Margaret pressed on. "With every life fed to it, every secret buried, every moment of moral cowardice, it grew stronger and hungrier. You didn't manage it, you enabled it." The entity's roar shifted to something approaching panic as more and more victims broke free from their preserved state. They surrounded the central mass, no longer silent and helpless but actively participating in the litany of accusations. "Emma Whaley," Margaret said, turning to the child thing that had been manipulating her since her arrival. "You were 7 years old when your grandparents sacrificed you, but you weren't innocent. You'd already been touched by the creature's influence, already been twisted into something that enjoyed others' pain." Emma's cheerful facade cracked, revealing something ancient and malevolent beneath. "I was just a child," she protested, but her voice now carried the harmonics of the entity itself. "You were never just a child," Margaret replied. "You were the creature's first successful experiment in wearing human form. It learned to mimic innocence by consuming yours, learned to manipulate through false vulnerability by studying your death. The preserved victims began to chant in unison, their voices weaving together in languages spanning multiple centuries. Margaret realized they were speaking the entity's true name, not the false identities it had worn, but the sound that described its essential nature. "And you," Margaret said, addressing the creature directly as its phosphorescent patterns began to dim and flicker, "you have fed on guilt and shame for so long that you've forgotten what happens when someone refuses to carry either. I will not accept responsibility for crimes I didn't commit. I will not inherit guilt that isn't mine. I will not perpetuate a cycle of violence just because my ancestors were too weak to break it." The entity's form began to convulse, its carefully maintained structure starting to collapse as Margaret's refusal to accept inherited guilt undermined the psychological foundation of its power. The tendrils connecting it to the preserved victims began to wither and snap, freeing minds that had been enslaved for decades. "I confess the truth about what you are," Margaret declared, her voice now amplified by the hundreds of freed victims. "You are a creature that mistakes manipulation for intelligence, that confuses hunger for purpose. You have spent over a century convincing my family that they were making necessary choices, but every choice was yours. Every death was your design. Every moment of suffering was your entertainment." The entity let out a final, deafening shriek as Margaret's words stripped away the last of its psychological camouflage. Without human guilt to sustain it, without inherited shame to feed on, its form began to dissolve into component parts that looked disturbingly organic. But as it collapsed, the creature made one final attempt at manipulation. "If you destroy me," it gasped through Emma's disintegrating form, "the house will collapse. You'll be buried here with all these victims. Is your moral purity worth hundreds of lives?" Margaret looked around at the freed victims, seeing hope in their eyes for the first time in decades. "Is survival worth perpetuating evil?" she asked them. Their answer came as a unanimous roar of "no." The cavern began to shake as the entity's dissolution destabilized the supernatural forces that had maintained the space beneath the house. Margaret grabbed the indigenous woman's hand as cracks appeared in the ceiling, raining down debris that should have buried them all. "The way out is up," the woman said, pointing to a shaft of natural light that had appeared where none had existed before. "The creature's death is breaking its hold on the physical world. The space it created is returning to normal dimensions." Margaret and the hundreds of freed victims began to climb, following the light toward a surface that had been denied to them for far too long. Behind them, the entity's death throes shook the very foundations of reality, but ahead lay the promise of dawn and freedom from inherited curses. As they emerged into the San Diego sunlight, Margaret turned back to see the Whaley house collapsing in on itself, but the destruction was contained. The evil that had spread underground for over a century was finally being cauterized from the earth. Margaret stood in the empty lot where the Whaley house had been, watching the last wisps of supernatural fire fade into the morning air. Around her, the freed victims were discovering what it meant to be alive again after decades of preservation. Some wept, some laughed, and others simply stood in stunned silence, feeling sunlight on their skin for the first time since their supposed deaths. The indigenous woman placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You did something no one in your family had the courage to attempt," she said. "You chose truth over survival, confession over concealment." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "It's not over, is it? That thing mentioned other families, other bloodlines that had been touched by its influence." "The creature's death will weaken those connections," the woman replied, "but you're right, the corruption has spread beyond a single house. There are other places in San Diego where similar entities have taken root, other families trapped in cycles of inherited guilt." Over the following weeks, Margaret discovered the true scope of what she'd inherited. Her phone began receiving calls from strangers who claimed to be distant relatives, cousins and second cousins from families she'd never heard of. All of them had received packages similar to hers: brass keys, cryptic notes, invitations to return to houses they'd never seen. The Hendersons, the Mortons, the Ramirez family, all the bloodlines that had been consumed by the original entity had produced offspring who'd fled San Diego, spreading across the country to escape their inherited curses. But now their children and grandchildren were being called back, summoned by smaller entities that had fed on the psychic residue of the original creature's crimes. Margaret made the difficult decision to stay in San Diego and track down these other descendants. She rented a small apartment near the site where the Whaley house had stood and began reaching out to the families who were just beginning to discover their terrible heritage. The first was David Henderson, a software engineer from Portland whose grandmother had fled San Diego in 1923. He'd received his key 3 days after Margaret destroyed the original entity, along with directions to a Victorian house in the Gaslamp Quarter that had been boarded up for decades. "I don't understand any of this," David said when Margaret met him at a coffee shop near the house. "My grandmother never talked about San Diego, never mentioned any family here. Why would someone want me to go to a house I've never seen?" Margaret explained as gently as she could about inherited curses, about entities that fed on family guilt, about the choice between perpetuating cycles of violence or risking everything to break them. David listened with the same expression of disbelief and growing horror that Margaret remembered from her own awakening. "So you're telling me that my great-grandfather was murdered by your great-great-grandfather, and now some monster wants me to either feed it more victims or become a victim myself?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Margaret replied. "But you have an advantage I didn't have. You know what you're walking into. You can prepare for the psychological manipulation, the false choices, the attempts to make you complicit in ongoing crimes." David stared at the brass key he'd placed on the table between them. "What if I just don't go? What if I throw this away and forget any of this ever happened?" Margaret had wondered the same thing about other descendants who might choose denial over confrontation. The entities are patient, but they're not infinitely so. The longer you avoid fulfilling your inherited obligations, the more creative they become in forcing your hand. They might target your family members, your friends, anyone connected to you who could be used as leverage. Over the following months, Margaret developed a system for helping descendants confront their inherited curses. She would meet with them beforehand, explaining the psychological tactics they could expect, the false choices they would be offered, the importance of refusing to accept guilt for crimes they hadn't committed. Some succeeded in breaking their families' cycles, walking out of cursed houses as the entities collapsed from starvation. Others chose the path of least resistance, becoming recruiters and perpetuating the violence for another generation. And a few simply disappeared, their fates unknown but easily guessed. Margaret kept detailed records of each case, building a database of supernatural contamination that stretched back to the earliest days of San Diego's development. She began to see patterns, certain areas of the city where multiple entities had taken root, families whose crimes had been particularly heinous and thus attracted stronger parasites. The work was exhausting and often dangerous. Some of the entities were more powerful than others, some had learned from the original creature's defeat and developed new strategies. Margaret found herself becoming something between a counselor and an exorcist, helping people confront inherited trauma while simultaneously battling supernatural forces that fed on unresolved guilt. But gradually, house by house and family by family, the network of supernatural corruption that had grown beneath San Diego began to weaken. Each entity destroyed meant fewer psychic tendrils reaching out to influence the living, fewer cycles of inherited violence perpetuating themselves across generations. On the 1-year anniversary of the Whaley house's destruction, Margaret returned to the empty lot where it had stood. The city had planted grass and installed a small memorial plaque that mentioned the tragic fire that had claimed the historic building, but made no reference to the true nature of what had been destroyed. The indigenous woman was waiting for her, as Margaret had somehow known she would be. "How many more?" Margaret asked, settling down on the grass beside her. "Fewer each month," the woman replied. "The original contamination is dying out as you break the cycles that sustained it." But there will always be new sources of corruption, new places where human cruelty accumulates until it attracts hungry things from the spaces between worlds. Margaret nodded, understanding that her work would never truly be finished. There would always be another family trapped by inherited guilt, another entity feeding on unresolved trauma, another choice between perpetuating violence and risking everything to stop it. But for the first time since receiving that mysterious brass key, Margaret felt something approaching peace. She had chosen truth over comfort, confession over concealment, and in doing so had broken a cycle that had consumed her family for over a century. As the sun set over San Diego, Margaret stood and dusted off her clothes. Somewhere in the city, another descendant was probably receiving a mysterious package, another key was being inserted into a lock that had waited decades to be opened. And when that person called for help, Margaret would be ready to answer. The foundation had been rotten, but foundations could be rebuilt. The question was whether they would be built on truth or on the same lies that had sustained the corruption for so long. Margaret walked back to her car, her phone already buzzing with a call from an unknown number. Another descendant, another choice, another chance to break the chains that bound the living to the crimes of the dead. The work continued. If this story stayed with you through Margaret's journey into the darkness beneath her family's legacy, comment, the foundation was always rotten.